Hello YouTube viewers, this is Bill, and I wanted to make a clip talking about not only the real book, the collection of jazz standards, but also about sheet music books in general, because not all sheet music books are created the same. And there seems to be a lot of confusion. I've seen some reviews of the real book where people will say, I don't understand, this isn't a piano book at all, this is terrible. Or people I've worked with even in bands who've looked at a lead sheet and say, oh, so like where's the bass line in this? And have to try to explain it's not there and why. So hopefully I'll clear up some confusion some of you may have. Maybe you'll learn something from this video. So before we begin with the real book, let's talk about some of the other different sheet music books. And here's a sheet music book I have of the Red Hot Chili Peppers album, Mother's Milk, from 1988. My favorite album of theirs. And this is the complete album, transcribed instrument for instrument, note for note. So we have the vocal line, the melody, and the lyrics. And as that's going on simultaneously, it's pretty much laid out almost as an orchestrated piece would be. The lead guitar, rhythm guitar, and transcribed with tablature for both of those tracks, the bass line, the tablature for those, drum transcriptions as well, because yes, drums do have a standard notation for them too, what drum you're hitting when. So people might see this and say, okay, why isn't every book like this then? Why don't they just give you everything transcribed note for note? Well, there's a couple different reasons. First of all, this is pretty excessive. You don't necessarily need everything instrument for instrument. And there are specific instrument books. So, for example, guitar tablature books, which will still have the vocal line and the lyrics transcribed, but then also the guitar lines, just the notes of the guitar parts with the solos and everything, and the tablature. Likewise, other instruments. I'm a bass player, so I have much more bass guitar books than I have guitar books. Same idea here, where you have the bass line transcribed appropriately in the bass clef. Melody line is still there, also chord changes too underlying that, which we'll talk about later when we talk about fake books. I almost said Facebooks. Spending too much time on Facebook. So you can also get instrument books for instruments that don't even necessarily show up on the recordings or how they were originally composed. J.S. Bach did not compose his pieces for the bass guitar, but he nonetheless did compose pieces that had melodies, and it is possible to go reproduce those on the bass guitar or other instruments. So here's a fun book, J.S. Bach for bass, if you want to go play those Bach lines on your bass guitar. I also have a J.S. Bach for mandolin that I got from my brother. So one of the most common instrument-specific books is the piano book, and I think there are two different kinds of piano books, and this comes back to the central difference of sheet music books, how some are specific to a recording and some are just specific to the song in terms of the elements in and of itself. So here's a Tori Amos piano book that I found this in a bookstore for 50 cents. Quite a steal. And just as before, we get the vocal melody. You can always tell when a book is transcribed for piano because you'll see that brace there with the treble and the bass clefs together. So you have the left hand there and the right hand, what notes they're playing. And that makes sense for Tori Amos since pretty much that whole entire album is piano. There's some other instruments as well, but she's reproduced some of those things solo with just her singing and playing the piano. But there are lots and lots of rock and pop and jazz books that are transcribed for piano, even if they don't really have any piano in the songs. So this is a book from the Police that I got back in, I was in high school. And it's nice. It has every single one of their studio songs and most of the B-sides as well. And even though, there isn't piano necessarily in these songs, they still transcribe these for piano. So, roughly speaking, guitar lines are put on the treble clef, the bass lines are put in the bass clef. One thing that kind of annoys me as a bass player is that sheet music for bass guitar, and for that matter upright bass, is actually written an octave up from where the sound actually is to make it easier to read. So when you get these transcription books of piano where they try putting the bass line of piano, you have all these annoying ledger lines way below, and you gotta read a little deeper for that. But there are lots of books transcribed for piano, even if they don't have piano in them. I think simply because it was a really popular instrument, and it wasn't unusual up until a generation or two ago that you had a piano in the house, and you'd entertain guests by playing songs on the piano, and here's the way to go play them. So this brings us to the concept of the fake book, as it is. So what is a fake book? Well, as I was showing before with the Red Hot Chili Peppers example, you don't necessarily need to have everything transcribed instrument for instrument, note for note from a song to make that song recognizable. I mean, even in the case of these songs from the Police, if I pulled out Roxanne and played that on the piano, I think people would hear that and say, oh yeah, I know what song that is. It's Roxanne. Even if it's not played with guitar and bass and it's played on piano, I can still understand what song it is. So fake books have that minimal amount of information you need to fake your way through a song. So you'll see the lyrics, of course, are in there, and the transcribed melody line, and then maybe the chords, and then that's about it. So the underlying chords. So ideally, like a wedding band, for example, could take this and say, okay, you play those chords on there, and we'll play the melody this way. Our singer will sing this, and it will be passable enough for the wedding, even if they may not be playing, say, the bass line exactly as it was played there, or the drums exactly as it was. It certainly helps if you're already familiar with the song, so then this will just give you, again, the minimal amount of information you need to go fake your way through it. And before I continue, quick word about lyrics. Just because you have lyrics printed in a sheet music book doesn't necessarily mean they're correct. Because, and for that matter, the music as well. Because a lot of these transcriptions are sort of done by people, like by ear. And this Police book in particular has some pretty funny, clearly wrong examples of lyrics. But anyway, fake books are really all you need most of the time. Here's another fake book, one of many I have. Here's a Latin fake book. So a bunch of Latin jazz standards. Same idea. I also really much prefer books that have a nice spiral bound like this, so you can actually open them all the way and they sit nicely on a music stand. It's a little tougher with some of these other ones, the way that they're bound. So after talking about fake books, this brings us to the real book. So what is the real book? Well, as I understand it, a bunch of jazz musicians in the late 60s, early 70s got kind of frustrated with the way most fake books were printed. A lot of them had inaccuracies, and maybe were printed in really, really tiny writing, tiny font, made it hard to read. As you're trying to do a show and read it from the sheet music stand. So their idea was, okay, instead of let's make a fake book, but let's call it the real book, so it'll be much more accurate to the versions of these songs that we know. And so the real book was a collection of a bunch of different jazz standards. And you can see, is written in a much bigger, easy to read font. Nice big chord names, and kind of a consistent font throughout. Sort of a nice handwritten font. And with some little extra bits on how to match things. So the real book was something that I've seen in just about every single high school and college jazz ensemble and most jazz bands too. Somebody in the band will have a real book. A lot of the times, as a bass player in the jazz ensembles in high school and college, they would toss me a page from the real book and say, okay, do a walking bass line over these chord changes. Yeah, and I apologize to any jazz musicians who kind of froze when they saw Autumn Leaves, because some people have bad memories of having to do that, that song over and over again. But anyway, one of the problems with the real book is that when it was originally made, there were no clearances on the copyrights or anything. So it was an underground item. Music stores carried them, but you had to kind of know somebody who knew somebody to get them. They wouldn't. If you asked for them right away, they would deny that they had them. But some of them would have them, underneath the counter. But Sher Music Company made a legal version of the real book and called it the New Real Book. So they corrected some of the mistakes along the way. They also threw in some nice photographs of some people, some of the players, as you saw. And there we go, there's Sonny Rollins. And appropriate enough across from the standard St. Thomas. So the real book is still used by a lot of jazz ensembles, especially high school and college students. Will get a, photocopy a piece of this and ask to go play it. So that's the real book and fake books, and talk about all the different other sorts of sheet music books. So before you see a sheet music book and complain, oh, there's no guitar tablature here, or oh, why is this not a piano book? And you can see, well, fake books will usually, and real books for that matter, will say they're a C vocal version or a C version. That means it's transcribed in the same concert pitch. That's a whole other subject for another video. But suffice it to say, not all instruments are transcribed the same exact way, note for note. And when you tell a clarinet player to play a B flat, it might not be the same B flat on a piano. But that's a whole other story. So there's a little introduction to different sheet music books in the real book and fake books. This is Bill. Thanks.